Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi.
Okay.
Yep.
This is Bazon speaking.
Hi. I'm Cassidy. Um, so I guess let's get right into it. So can you just introduce yourself and what do you do?
Well, generally, I may characterize my type of work as action teaching.
Mm-hmm.
That means to ensemble all techniques of theater, teaching in general, medical treatment, etc., to enforce the ability of getting something clear, getting something done, and teaching someone in a way that we can say teaching doesn't mean anything else but to give an example of how you may deal with problems. So give an example of how you deal with a problem. That's my general doing, or doing in general.
I see. So I guess sort of connected to that, what is your goal as an educator, I guess? At what point have you done your job successfully?
Well, I have been a professor for 50 years at universities in all over the world, in Israel, in Denmark, in France, in Holland, in Germany, of course, in Germany for the most the most time I spent in Germany, yes, uh, even in USA. But in general, the aim is to convince people that they could be able to deal with problems even if they are unsolvable. Because normally people believe that they have a problem that should be solved. But solving problems means, in modern times, to create new problems. There's no other way to solve a problem than to create other problems. Think about atomic energy politics, you know? So the aim is to give uh, more and more people the ability to use electric energy, but the costs that you have to pay, not even in money, but in future obligations, uh, are much higher than the original problem of the need of electricity. So problems are only problems if they are unsolvable. And that's the message in general. So I started an institute which was dedicated to the way of working on problems, in managing problems instead of solving them. Managing means to be aware that a problem is not solvable and therefore it's important. You know, so the importance of problems is related to uh, the kind of unsolvability they confront us with. So there are highest ranks of unsolvability, let's say like men are dedicated to death because finally everything which uh, is called a human being in the end has to be confronted with death. So it's generally impossible to get rid of this problem of um, being dedicated to death. So what do you do instead of uh, trying to solve this problem? You manage it. You create a new center of social beliefs and helps, let's religions or social activities, etc. So everything which really helps us to survive as mankind or as individuals within a society of other individuals means that we have to accept that all the really important problems are unsolvable and that we can't just declare the solvability of problems. And this is one of the major failure of modernity, because in modern times, let's say 19th, 20th century, people believe that every problem which they are confronted with, diseases or poorness or whatever, it could be solved. And that's a completely irrational belief.
So how does, I guess, art connect to that? Because at least from my understanding, a lot of your work has been at least connected to art. So how do you, I guess, use art or talk about art in relation to this problem management?
Well, the problem management is related on experimental activities. You have to find out how you could, in the best way, manage unsolvable problems. So the experiment is the foundation of winning always, even by failure, because an experiment is successful if your beliefs or your thesis are falsified, as Popper said, yes, to falsify. Now, you can only win. There's no loser within the experimental methods. Experiment is the only way of always being successful in managing unsolvable problems. Because if you show by experimental results that your beliefs are wrong, you are really aware of being a helpful scientist, because you helped to get rid of some false ideas. So a normal scientist is always eager to demonstrate the falseness of his beliefs. And this is the highest intellectual ranking attitudes of mankind, that I am forced to show to others that my beliefs are wrong, because that's the only way to work on criticism, which is really important. Is the criticism of truth, because everybody naively means that truth is the ultimate authority, but that's completely unusable, because if a medical doctor tells you that the truth of your stomach disease is bacteria working in the stomach, then he has to criticize this truth. The truth is that there are bacteria working in your stomach. So he has to criticize this truth, this really proven truth, that bacteria are the sources of your diseases. So criticize the truth, that's all. And we have a name for the potential to criticize truth that's called utopia. Utopian thinking is, since the 16th century, the way of criticizing the truth. Naive people do believe that we have to criticize falseness, we have to criticize just false beliefs or something. No, we have to criticize truth. That's what's is constitutional for scientific work and poetry work and artists' work and so
on. So connected to that, I you've been talking a lot about experiments and experimentation. So how
yeah.
exactly do you define an experiment? Because I've noticed that I think people people define that word differently. So how do you define it?
Well, by giving a proposition and then explain in which way you could, by experiments, prove whether these propositions are useful or not. That's all. Mm-hmm. And it's an experiment in painting, for instance, yeah? Or in poetry, or in scientific work as building theories or whatever. It's always the same. And that's all we need. We do not need anything else. And that's, I mean, the Cajun way. Cajun guy, John Cage, the
Hmm.
Cajun way, you know, it's only a few ideas which you have to practice, and then you will be able to follow all philosophers since 2,500 years and all scientists since 600 years and so on. The truth is very, very easy to understand, because the truth is a horrible, inhuman aspect of being. It's not the false. The false is human, because it's quite human to have false ideas. But if you have to accept the truth, then the truth is a dictator which forces you under the authority of truth. And you have no chance other than to work on utopian aspects. That means find out how you can get a proper criticism of this truth. It's the most fundamentalistic dictatorship of all, the truth, just the truth. Because for centuries, everybody working against authorities like churches or believing people or whatever, everybody thought that thought of truth is the ultimate aim of working intellectually or as an artist and so on. No, no, it's not. Truth is the most inhuman aspect which we are confronted with.
Hmm. So I guess in connection to what you were saying about your I guess definition of an experiment, at what point is a proposition useful? What does it mean for a proposition to be useful?
A proposition is useful if you, by following these propositions, can judge about the proposition itself.
Mm-hmm.
No, you can judge about your ideas which are formulated as this proposition. So you can be self-resistant, you can be critical against yourself. And how could you ever be aware of what you say yourself, of what you believe yourself, if you are not able to criticize it in a way that it makes you personally impotent? You know? So if you really use the wrong way of criticism, you get impotent. But how to be potent again? By criticism. That's the really, no? If you are strong in believing, in a religious sense, then you have to prove your ability to doubt, because the ability to doubt is the fundamental basis for truth in believing. You see? So criticism and doubtfulness, that's what is meant by working with propositions.
I see.
You can only be sure of something if you completely doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Or if you completely criticize your beliefs, then you are sure that you already have some fundamental, strong beliefs you can use in your orientation of everyday's life.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess sort of related to criticism in a way, what is good art? How do you define a good piece of art?
Yeah. Well, we have a tradition of about 600 years of using the term art. And this meant to be able to understand in which way individuals could create authorities by being authors. Because in a normal way, only collectives like the parties, the churches, industries and so are authorities as being the authorities for collective meaning, collective work, etc. And 600 years ago, in Europe, in northern Italy and southern Germany, people started to believe that one individual could be an authority you have to listen to, because he creates authority by being an author. And if you look upon all the fantastic successes in natural sciences, in poetry, in art in general, you will easily find out that every success was possible because of the work of an individual. And then collective groups did take over and used it in the market as products or whatever. But the original power to get something which is criticized and not just thrown away, then you have to accept that authority by authorship is much more important, or has been much more important for successful European sciences and so on, the last 600 years, than the authorities of collectivity, of groups, of parties, of industries, and etc. And that's what defines art. Art is the criticizable and not just fading away attitude of an individual to get authority by being an author. So if he can organize a text or a painting or a piece of music in a way that you can get confronted with this authority of an author, that means his ability to create a general idea about life and death, or the human being, or the organization of societies, or cosmology, or whatever, then you have, as someone who does it, the belief, or let's say the proof that that was an artist, or that is an artist. He really is an artist because as an individual, he gives us more productive doubt, productive criticism about the world than all these collective authorities do. Because the collective authorities do force us under their authority. They want us to become a member of the party. They want us to believe what the church is telling us, etc. But individuals do not force us under their authority. They just demonstrate this authority by convincing us that an individual, as an individual, this poor one little man is able to create insights, knowledges of the world which are more convincing than the beliefs of religious groups or entrepreneurs or whatever. And that is art. Art is the ability to convince people of some worked out knowledges or results of thinking which open up your mind to understand what's going on with you, within the world, as a living being, within the society, and so on. So you understand much more what's going on by using works of art, meaning works of authorities by authorship, than use authority by collectives of
Okay,
power.
yeah, that makes sense. So I guess my question about that is, well, I guess I have a few. Um, I guess let's start. Well, can art be created collectively then, if it's all about?
No, no,
No?
cannot. No, that's impossible. That's the contradictory. Contradictory. The definition is art is related to one individual as an authority by authorship. That's the definition given by Petrarca and all the other humanists. That's the center of 14th century, the mid of 14th century, and of course 15th and 16th century in Europe. It's only then that we have the term art. There was no term art in Greece or in Rome or in Egypt. Of course, the Egyptian, the Hittite, the Baal cultures were highly developed without any definition of art. There was no authority of an individual. There was the highest ranking cultures ever we could think of, the Egyptians, yeah, the Persian, and so on, without any idea of individuals as artists. The term artist was created 600 years ago and not earlier. The antique cultures did know about how to do something. They said techne in Greek. Techne means the way in which you do something so that you can create something useful. But it was no authority by an individual. It was just the authority of the empiric knowledge of the collective of men.
Okay. That makes sense. So I guess is the authority of the individual that's I guess sort of created by art, is that sort of inherently in contradiction or challenging to the existing sort of collective authorities of, you know, the party and the church that you were talking
Yeah,
about before? Is
yeah.
there a way for that authority to not be challenging to the existing one, for the individual authority to not be challenging to the existing collective ones?
Yeah. Normally, collective societies do accept individuals only when they are aware that these individuals could do no harm to the collective authorities and so on. But in 1400 in Europe, they started with the keen idea that the usefulness of individuals is related to their opposition to what is a successful meaning or successful authority of collectives. So the individuals as authority by authorship always did create opposition to the authorities of collectives, always. So it's a function of authority by authorship to prove whether the collective authorities who are building the government, the military forces, nearly everything which is really important. So how could you be ever sure that these collective authorities are not just following insane stupidities like in Hitler or Stalin or whatever? So only by accepting the contradictory proofs of individuals as authority of authorship.
That makes sense. So I guess what's the goal of creating art? Why do people make art? What are they trying to accomplish?
They want to live under, let's say, sure beliefs, something which really counts to them as being sure, or being a cosmological idea which really means something. And this is only possible if you are able to criticize what you believe to be sure. And criticism is only an ability of individuals. collective institutions that can never be critical against themselves, because then they would lose their authority. So it's only on the shoulder of individuals where we can found strong beliefs, real knowledge by criticism and doubt. That's all. If you have the ability to really doubt about everything you believe, then you have the authority of an individual as author, authority by authorship, doubtfulness and criticism. I mean, really radical criticism. A collective authority can never risk to criticize itself. It would lose the function. Let's say government, which is criticizing themselves in a fundamental way, it loses their function to rule society or the world or whatever, to rule the waves. They would lose it. So therefore, it's only the function of individuals to found strong beliefs on doubt and to start to criticize the truth as the really important way of dealing with problems, because problems are principally unsolvable if they are problems. If problems would be solvable, then you won't have any problems. You just solve them. Where are the problems? Solve them. No, nothing. Solvability of problems means you have no problems. And that's what the collectives always tell you. They are able to manage problems. They have the authority to solve problems, and they can manage nearly every problem in the coexistence of individuals in a million examples and so on. No, they have no chance to solve any problem. They have only by insight of individual and authorities of authorship, they have the chance to understand that they are not almighty, that they cannot solve the problem, and then they have to find out how you could manage the principally unsolvable problems. And this is the function of individuals as authors, as artists, and so on.
So, okay, so what is the relationship, I guess, between politics and social issues and art? Are those things
Yeah, it's quite clear.
connected?
It's quite clear. It's very easy to understand. If you are a scientist today, you can only develop your authority as an individual, as scientist, no? Because you can't be a scientist by being Chinese or Jewish, because if you are a physicist, it's to be a physicist completely different from being a Jew or Chinese or black or yellow or whatever. So you have to leave the culture to become a scientist or an artist. So the opposition is art and science against cultures, because cultures guarantee the survival of groups of men, and men can only survive by being member of a group. But that's very risky, so they need the confrontation with doubt and criticism on their beliefs and their politics, on their decisions, which are existential for so many people who belong to them. And nowadays, even every government in the world has to understand that their decisions are no longer decisions for their culture. It's just universal. It's global. But that's a newer problem, let's say that's 20 years ago. It started with the Protocol of Rome and so on. But in general, it's quite clear that the fundamental, we call it Kulturkampf, the fight of cultures, is the fight between art and science on the one side and societies, collectives, religions, organizations of politics, etc. on the other side. Everybody is dependent on a culture he belongs to, But if he wants to become an artist or scientist, he has to leave his culture, his beliefs from childhood on. He lived in this kind of pure beliefs, and he has to leave it if he wants to become an artist or a scientist. And that's what's going on. Kulturkampf, the fight of culture, it's not the fight of civilization. The fight of culture means that you have, even if you will depend with your language, with your belief, with your manner of preparing food and so on, you depend on the culture you are born into. But to be an artist and a scientist, you have completely, radically to quit the dependence on your culture. But you can't, because with your language and your let's say your manners of tasting, etc., you will be dependent on your culture lifelong. And that's the conflict you're working in. On the one side, you depend on your culture because no individual can survive without being a member of a culture. On the other hand, you can only really rely on your cultural beliefs, etc., if you start to criticize them, if you prove the beliefs by doubting. And this is what you have to do as an individual, getting rid of your belonging to the cultural security insights and whatever. And so you have to get a fundamental opposition to the culture you belong to. That's the tragic of human being. You have to be a member of a culture, otherwise you can't survive. Being fundamentally raised, brought up by being introduced to some manners of cooking or clothing or speaking, etc. And on the other hand, you can only survive if you start fundamentally to prove whether the cultural beliefs are really useful for the society, for the culture in future. And this you can only risk as an individual. As an individual, you can risk to doubt fundamentally. As an individual, you can risk to criticize the truth. As a member of a culture, you can't risk to criticize the truth, because otherwise you can't survive. So that's the conflict, and that's why the opposition of art and culture, art and science on the one hand to cultures, religions, and so on the other hand, the fundamental power is so important. Nowadays, what is the real conflict in this fight, cultural fight? And this is, if you want to really work as a scientist, you have to get means, let's say dollars, to start your work. And only cultures are able to give you this money. So you depend on the cultural abilities, getting money, for just the opposite, to criticize the fundamental beliefs of this culture. And therefore, because it's quite understandable, you start to develop some attitudes which are not very useful. You say, okay, I will get the money and I will accept all the conditions which are fundamentally for those who give this money to me, who believe in me as being useful for their purposes. So you get only the money if the donor of the money are believing that they can be useful as an artist or scientist for their purposes. Their purposes are the opposite of science and art. So you get into fundamental conflicts. And that's what the situation nowadays worldwide, in China, in Hong Kong, in the United States, all over where heritage foundations to protect heritage are not able to understand what really heritage means. And that's, let's say, this kind of sum of my work. I started 50 years ago with the idea, why do since 2,500 years, all cultures we nowadays rely on with our developments are so much focused on the new. Everybody is dedicated to the idea of the new products, the new ideas, the new manners, and so on. Why? If something is new, then it has no definitions. Otherwise, it wouldn't be new. So if you would know what newness is, then it's no longer new. So by definition, something which is new couldn't mean anything to you because you have no idea what it's about. There's only one way to learn about the newness of the new. That means the completely openness, by relying on traditions, because you know about traditions. And if you start on the idea of the new, looking back to traditions, you find out that your insight into traditions, your judgment about tradition changes completely. You have a completely new look on traditions by the force of newness. So the function of dedicating one artist or whatever scientist to the new is to orientate you on an ever going on relation to traditions, because you change traditions, and that's a function of new. And if artists and scientists, let's say since the last 600 years, are in the first ring, those who create new ideas, the avant-garde, called the avant-garde. The avant-garde is the guarantee for functioning relations with the traditions. So it's renewing traditional securities. It's renewing the part of the world you live in, which you really know, but you know only under the ever new attitudes towards the tradition. Yeah. So the 20th century was so successful, let's say, in arts and science, because under the pressure of the new, nearly everybody had to be orientated in a complete new way to traditions. So you opened nearly a museum every fortnight because the newness of the arts and the sciences forced you to have a new impression, a new way of looking on the traditions, and to create new traditions. So the newness of the arts and scientists created traditions. And that's the function of newness, to create traditions. And that's all of the successful story of arts and sciences in the Western world. And only in the Western world, we had this idea of authority by authorship, and nowhere else. The Chinese culture was much higher entwickelt than the European culture, let's say, up to the 12th century, much higher. The Egyptian culture has always been much higher developed than we can think of in Europe before 15th century, 14th, 15th century. But they did not know about authority by authorship of individuals like artists and scientists. And therefore, even if they were much higher developed, the Chinese, for instance, they did not develop the ideas about progress in mankind, in politics, in science, and so on, because that's depending on the authority of individuals as authors and critics, scientists, and artists.
Okay. So I guess let's start. I feel like generally when people talk about progress in society or politics or what have you, they sort of mean getting closer to solving problems. So if problems are unsolvable, what
Yeah.
does progress mean?
Progress means that, let's say, within arts, there is a development without the idea of progress, in a way that the newest newness is completely destroying the old beliefs and abilities and so on. No, let's say 16th century, you start with Perugia, then you have Raphael, then Leonardo, then Michelangelo, and then Caravaggio. So all of these have been created principally unsolvable problems for artists. Therefore, they are actual now. And there's no progress from Raphael to Caravaggio, from 1520 when Raphael died to Caravaggio's excesses of 1600. No, there's no progress, but there's always a very important inherent dynamics of going on. And going on means to ever better create the idea of unsolvability instead of managing, and of course, developing the ability in nearly every man to be an artist or to be a scientist, because principally every man could be educated to be able to be an authority by authorship, authority by thinking himself, by being able to judge about cosmologies, to be able to criticize the beliefs of his own culture.
Okay, that makes sense. So you talked earlier about how or I guess mentioned earlier about certain cultures being higher cultures than other. What do you mean by a higher culture?
Well, by more powerful managing of bigger segments of nature. So the Chinese have been able to develop the idea of the center of the world. So China was the center itself. By centering means to have a complete order of stability in relations between the center and the far more outstanding events of society going on and so on. So they were higher developed in the way of being able to manage much more of let's say the confrontations with nature. You know, they have been able to, in a better way, to manage the confrontations of the power of the sea, the power of volcanism, the power of illnesses, and so on. That means higher developed.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I guess what is a culture trying to accomplish then? What's, I guess, the goal of culture? Is it just I guess become stronger or have sort of a stronger work stronger against nature? Is that the goal of culture, or is it something else?
Yeah, in a way, it's to create security in attitudes, in beliefs, in the way of doing things, in the idea of surviving in the future, of being a social unit which could not be destroyed just by let's say the volcanism or catastrophe like in Fukushima with an earthquake and something else. So they believe in having a calculable future. That's what cultures do. You have a calculatable, you can calculate about the future. And you have the security that this calculation will count for nearly every member of your culture. And so you have the unification of all these different people with under one idea, that we follow the same idea that we can organize our surviving in the future. So that's what cultures have to do, to guarantee. And all cultures of the world, in the whole of history, let's say the last 35,000 years or 60,000 years, whatever, was to get the idea of having a future by following general ideas in which everybody, every member of this culture is believing in or is following, and so on. We have a future. And on the other hand, we have the criticism of individuals like prophets or artists or philosophers or scientists who say, no, with this kind of beliefs about the future, this society is not secure as having the guarantee to survive. No, we have to change this and those propositions, attitudes, believings. Otherwise, this culture will fade away. And it is a fact that even the strongest cultures of mankind's history faded away. The Egyptians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Roman, I mean, unbelievable, cultural, successful societies. They're just gone. So how could you develop nowadays the idea of having a future if even the Roman Empire, even the Greek culture, even the Persian, the Baal culture, the Egyptian culture, it faded away, nothing. It's just dust in the desert. So how could you start believing in your future if you look upon these highly developed culture, really powerful energies working in nearly every aspect which men can think of as being important, and then they faded away. Just nothing left since fragments of some material ruins. Yes, so the ruin is the only successful product of cultures, because the ruins still are to be seen nowadays, nothing else but ruins of Greeks and ruins of Romans and ruins of Persians and ruins of Egyptian cultures. That's all. So therefore you could, the idea, let's ruin our culture, and then we will have the guarantee that in the future, the newer men than those days will even be confronted with the fact that we have ever lived, by being confronted with the ruins we leave. And the most important ruins of nowadays are the atomic plants. That's all. Nothing else. We have nothing to really ruin as something which guaranteedly will dominate the future. The ruins of atomic plants will dominate as ruins the future of mankind. So that's the truth. Now you have to start to criticize this truth by being an artist, being a scientist, being a prophet or whatever. So start. Yeah.
So if cultures are trying to create a calculatable future, and art is inherently critical of cultures, is art critical of sort of creating a calculatable future, or is it criticizing the cultures in order to for their own advantage, I guess? So what's the relationship between these calculatable futures and art?
Well, that art is depending, science is depending on the donations, on the money, on the powers of doing things which are developed within the cultures. So that's dependent. But generally, poets or artists or scientists criticize all cultural beliefs, in guaranteeing a future, in surviving in a wishful way, or even develop some ways in which one could hope to survive. No, they say you have to live as an individual with the secure knowing that you will die. So what you are as an individual have to carry out, you have to stand the idea that all what living means to you is, in the end, to be confronted with this is exactly the same to cultures. In the end, as the cultural history says, and history of culture says, there's nothing but doubt, dust and ruins. So start to ruin yourself, and that means to musealize yourself, because the museums are the collections of ruins of cultures. So start to give yourself the attitude of being averse to get into a museum, to write books or to work out ideas or theory or whatever, that you could survive as a ruin of yourself. That's all. Yeah, well, it's a pity, but it's really to be thought of that the only secure, let's say, expectation about the future of our Western-oriented types of cultures is that there will be a sign of our former existence by the ruins of atomic plants. We are forcing the generations of 200 or 500 years or 1,000 years, whatever, if the world should be existing in those aspects of the future.
I see. So I think that's all I've got. So I mean, do you have any, I guess, any things to say before we
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I'm good to go. So
let me know what you're going to do with this kind of interview, and I would be glad if I could learn from you in which way it could have been useful for you to speak with me.
Yeah. So I'm the project that I'm doing a bunch of these interviews with various people, and then I'm creating art in response to those interviews. So in terms of this interview specifically, I'm not sure what art I'm gonna make, but recently I've been I don't know, making various paintings and films and photography projects in response to these interviews.
Then start to do that with the idea that you will create an undestroyable ruin. So start with the idea that I'm going to create a ruin which has a chance to survive the next 100, 150, 200 years. A ruin. So look upon your work as ruins you create yourself.
Mm-hmm.
In the European tradition, you have to start again what, let's say, was done in the 18th century, when in those days, architects, gardeners, philosophers, feudal authorities decorated the English parks with completely new ruins. Have you learned about that? That in nearly English park in Europe, they created with completely new material ruins which give or should give sign to the Roman or the Greek or the Egyptian heritages, you know? Mm-hmm. So if you could understand yourself as a ruin builder, as someone who is dedicated to surviving of material objects, yeah, you have to create a new system of ruination. How to ruin something that has the chance to survive. That's what we are asking you to do. So you are young, you are hopeful, you are powerful. Now start. Convince us with developing some objects which are convincing us by their qualities of being ruins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
And not perfect in a way that it's convincing as something, oh, beautiful, or whatever you could think of being dedicated to anyone in the market or museums. No, start by giving an example for the idea of surviving by ruination, by to give a character of ruin to something we work out properly. So work out properly, creating a ruins.
Okay,
Yeah?
thanks.
And
Okay,
if
thank you.
we will be in, where are you living? In Europe or where?
Yeah, I'm living in New York.
Okay, then this would be much easier to follow you with such an interview after we would have the chance to live under the English-speaking people for, let's say, 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, we would be perfect in speaking English. I proved it many times. Now I have within seconds to switch from a completely different language into English without having an idea what's going on or what we are dealing with. So I apologize for being so stammering in trying to express myself.
Mm-hmm. It's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
Let's hopefully meet again in times beyond this catastrophe without any ruins. Because what's going on now is a completely disastrous future, because by corona or diseases like this, nothing is created which could survive in the future as a ruin, and therefore it's so unhuman what's going on.
yeah.
We can be humans in having the idea of creating ruins as signs to the future. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me know what you're going on and what you have to do, what you have done with all these interviews. I would be very keen in showing it to our students.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep in touch.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Okay, thanks. See you later. Bye.
Yeah.